15th century Valencia. In the dead of night, agonized screams echo out from a wealthy household. Neighbors recalled seeing inhabitants writhing on the ground in pain, as if struck by a terrible illness. But what unfolded was not a disease, but rather a horrific crime. A once respected textile artisan had secretly laced the family's food, wine, and even the well with lethal arsenic. His own daughter and mother-in-law died amid screams of pain, and a few others barely made it out with their lives. One man was temporarily paralyzed. And that's just one story of medieval murder from Spain. We've got greed-driven poisoners, sadistic nobles, bandit gangs, really everything. And they're all as unpleasant as the next. So today we continue our series on medieval murderers. We've taken a little break from the macabre stuff, but we are well and truly back with a bang with this video. It's going to make up for that break in proceedings. Now allow me to begin by saying hello to any newcomers. Good to meet you and welcome to the channel. And let me give the customary thanks to those who keep everything ad-free on this channel, not just for this video, but, well, every one of the video in the playlist. Plenty of them to look through as well. This is because we are supported by those on Patreon, YouTube memberships, also the merch store, and the occasional donation through Super Thanks on YouTube and the PayPal link. Everything very appreciated on our end, keeping everything accessible for everyone. An ad-free sanctuary amid all the slop and advertisements. It's only getting worse out there, isn't it? At least you don't have to worry about it here. Now, with all that being said, I've said it once, I don't have to say it again. We can begin our journey into the medieval mind of the Spanish killer. And just as I said that, a heavy rain has begun to fall outside of my window. What a good atmosphere. Love doing videos like it when it's like that. In any case, let's begin. Our first story is known as the Poisoner of Valencia. You might have become a little bit familiar with him in the introduction, but let's go into a bit more detail. The name is Sanxo Calbó of Valencia, and this case provides one of the most detailed case studies of serial murder in medieval Spain. Now, as introduced, Sancho was a master weaver. But the problem was his fortunes were declining sharply in the early 1400s, enough to stress anyone out. Court testimony paints him as an embittered and merciless man, who, after being expelled from his guild for fraud, began to plot against his own family. Over the years, Sancho's desperation for monies just grew and grew. He pressured his daughter to rewrite her will in his favor, and when that failed, he resorted to Plan B, slowly poisoning the entire household. Now, what makes Sancho's case so especially compelling is the methodical nature of the murders. This wasn't a sudden fit of rage, but rather it was well planned. It was all sustained and premeditated, and that fits the profile of a coldly calculating serial killer, that's for sure. He acquired the poison in small purchases, so as not to arouse any suspicion. Of course, if you're showing up and buying a big bag of arsenic, and then your entire family dies a week later, well, it doesn't look very good, doesn't it? Well, the poison actually was railgar, which is a kind of arsenic sulfide. And it was quite easily obtained, too, since it had common uses. Think of things like pest control and also a pigment as well, which would make sense because of the weaving trade he's in. Essentially, he turned a household chemical into a murder weapon. Kind of like putting a little pinch of rat poison into food or something. Don't get any ideas, though. Now, Sancho contaminated everything. The well water everyone drank, the wine they enjoyed at dinner, the very confections and treats in the house, too. And in this way he intended to wipe out multiple victims at once. And indeed, the result was a multiple poisoning that killed 2 women and sickened several others. It was only by a miracle, or rather an immediate care, did his son-in-law, Père Roquet, survive the ordeal. And Père, once he recovered enough, became the denouncer that brought the entire case to court. From the trial records, we get an intimate view of Sancho's twisted mindset. Witnesses and the defendant's own confessions indicate that the motive was purely financial. This was essentially a case of familicide for profit. Sancho hoped to inherit the family property once his daughter and all the relatives were dead. And that's pretty chilling, that even as a medieval observer struggled to imagine the irrational lust for killing, they could well understand greed as a motive. In Sancho's case, the movil economico, as they call it. It was pretty clear. In fact, it's been described pretty bluntly, his moral decline. Sancho degenerated step by step until he considered that most horrifying of acts, murdering his own daughter for money. And well, all of that just shows how contemporaries framed this serial murderer, not in clinical terms of psychopathy, but as a once normal man who fell into evil and moral corruption. Of course, we already spoiled the outcome in the introduction. Sancho's torture-induced confession and his ghastly execution, being buried alive with his daughter's corpse. But there are fascinating little details that enrich the story further. For example, during the whole poisoning fiasco, as family members grew ill one by one, they desperately sought cures. The record tells us they tried everything, from professional doctors to homemade emetics. That is, something that will make you vomit up the toxin. One adivino moro, basically a Moorish seer or a wise man of sort, was even consulted, and he came with prayers and claimed a God-given gift to heal, showing a mix of Christian and Muslim medical practices in Valencia at the time. And get this, there was even a parish priest who showed up with a unicorn horn as an antidote. Sounds a bit like legend, but it is documented. And the priest truly administered water that had been in contact with a unicorn horn as an anti-poison measure. The fact that even local clergymen owned such an exotic object, likely a narwhal tusk passed off as a unicorn's horn, shows how seriously people took the threat of poison. Kings of Aragon kept reputed unicorn horns in their treasuries as safeguards too, and apparently even village healers might carry a piece, however much they could afford. Pretty rare to have an entire unicorn horn. Now, while modern science knows this would not actually neutralize arsenic, the attempt shows the medieval will to counteract the serial poisoner with every resource available, whether that be scientific or a little bit more on the magical side. Now, Sanxo Calbó's case had a pretty lasting impact. Some people said it was a crime that marked an era, and indeed, the trial led to changes in how Valencia regulated toxic substances, effectively tightening oversight of who could actually obtain poisons. In a sense, this 1442 incident forced authorities to anticipate and prevent future serial poisoners. A policy reaction, much like modern societies tracking chemical purchases after notorious crimes. Thus, Sancho's dark saga shows a window into the medieval serial murderer's world, but this is on a more domestic scale. His own family, his own daughter. What a monster. Secretive, calculated, but ultimately caught and punished with a spectacular public retribution. Multiple murder in medieval Spain was certainly not confined to low-born criminals, and ironically, one of the bloodiest figures responsible for numerous personal killings was none other than a king of Castile, Pedro I, reigning from 1350 to 1369, remembered by history with the epithet the Cruel. Don't get that for playing nice, don't you? To label King Pedro a serial killer in the modern sense is pretty provocative. Yet many contemporaries and later historians have certainly portrayed him as displaying a pathological cruelty beyond the usual brutality of medieval warfare or justice. Pedro's life reads like a grim catalogue of murderers, some political, and others frighteningly personal. A modern psychiatrist reviewing Pedro's behavior might indeed diagnose homicidal rage and sadistic tendencies. Pedro assumed the throne of Castile at only 16 years old, and very quickly earned his infamous moniker. Chroniclers like Pedro López de Ayala, who served in the courts of Castile during Pedro's era, document episode after episode of violence ordered or carried out by the king himself. One of Pedro's first acts was to execute his father's longtime mistress, Doña Leonor de Guzman, who had been a sort of queen mother in influence. In any case, he didn't like her, so she had to go. In 1351, Leonor was imprisoned, and soon after that, killed, ostensibly on Pedro's mother's orders. But with the young king's consent, of course. Nothing goes by him. And this certainly set a tone that Pedro would eliminate anyone he perceived as a threat. Ministers who fell out of favor were summarily beheaded. The king's own advisers warned him that his murderous paranoia would ruin him, but, well, falling on deaf ears, I think. There is one historical letter that survives, from one victim on the eve of execution, counseling Pedro, quote, "If you do not put aside the dagger, if you do not stop committing such murders, then you shall lose your realm and your place, your person, in the greatest jeopardy." This was a dying man's prophecy to a king, and it proved to be quite true, as Pedro's cruelty eventually rallied many against him. Perhaps the most notorious incident was the dinner betrayal of 1358. Pedro invited his half-brother, Don Fadrique, master of the military order of Santiago, to dine with him in royal Alcazar of Seville. Fadrique was received with quite warm reception, at least at first, but it was all a ruse. At the king's signal, armed men smashed Fadrique's skull with a mace, right there in the palace hall, just walked right up to him and started bludgeoning him. Imagine the mess. Pedro then unsheathed his own dagger and rampaged through the palace, personally slaying several of Fadrique's knights who had accompanied him. One chronicle chillingly notes that after the carnage, the king sat down to eat, where the master, Fadrique, lay dead. Well, that's a pretty interesting image. The monarch calmly dining next to the bloodied corpse of his half-brother, and it certainly sent shockwaves. Rumors spread quickly through noble society. Further to that, it exemplified Pedro's merciless temperament. This act was not part of a war, or even a judicial proceeding. It was basically because Pedro did not like him. A personal homicide, repeated multiple times in one evening. Of course, the poor knights, too, I'm sure they were all told to leave their weapons and armor at the front door, while the others hid their blades beneath their cloaks. But that wasn't it. You see, Pedro's cruelty extended even to those he had marital or romantic ties with. He famously imprisoned his wife, Blanche of Bourbon, a French princess, by the way, Bourbon being a French region. After only 3 days of marriage, this was, because he preferred his Castilian mistress. Which, of course, begs the question, why did you get married to the French girl anyway? Well, poor old Blanche languished for years before she was quietly disposed of, likely via poison. On Pedro's orders, of course. She died in 1361. The king also did not hesitate to kill former friends. During the civil war against his half-brother Enrique of Trastamara, Pedro won a major battle at Nayera in 1367, thanks to the Black Prince of England's help. In the aftermath, among the captured enemy was a Castilian noble who had once served Pedro, but decided to defect. Well, of course, this defector was certainly not happy to see Pedro, I can imagine. And Pedro was enraged by the betrayal. He strode up, and he stabbed the prisoner to death on the spot. Now this horrified even his English allies. The Black Prince himself rebuked Pedro, noting that this was a violation of chivalry, and not to mention counterproductive, since dead prisoners couldn't really pay much of a ransom. Pedro reportedly retorted that he would pay for all the captives he killed himself, if only he could be allowed to butcher them. Pretty alarming, isn't it? The English refused, though, fearing Pedro would simply kill every single one of them. And by these accounts, Pedro I of Castile exhibited a consistent pattern of killing that goes well beyond the typical medieval king's occasional execution of a rival. His motives were a blend of political calculation, paranoia, and rage. Not wholly random, yet often excessively personal. He seemed to enjoy, or at least insist on doing the bloody deed himself in many cases, which is what leads some to analogize him as a serial killer. The label might be a bit anachronistic, but certainly his contemporaries thought him possessed by a cruel streak. They just didn't quite have the vocabulary for it yet. As the medieval Spanish historian Clara Estow says, Pedro, quote, conceived a wholesome extermination of those he feared or hated, and his homicidal rage only grew as he eliminated former friends, one by one. As for the aristocracy, well, eventually they learned that reconciliation with Pedro was going to be perilous. More than one lord who made peace with him was soon found murdered under mysterious circumstances. A pattern of trust, suspicion, and violent reprisal marked Pedro's dealings, a cycle arguably analogous to certain modern serial killers who alternate between charm and lethal fury. And of course, you might also argue that Pedro was a tyrant executing political enemies, not a serial killer in the modern sense. And yes, it's true that his killings mostly served his hold on power. However, the sheer glut of personal murders including his own family members, and the relish with which he carried out some of these, for they certainly set him apart even in that violent age. So feared was Pedro's unpredictable bloodlust that it united almost all the Castilian nobility against him. And ultimately, in 1369, Pedro came to a violent end of his own. He was stabbed in a duel by his half-brother Enrique, the very man who had raised a rebellion to stop Pedro's atrocities. A darkly poetic turn. Pedro fell victim to the cycle of murder that he had perpetuated. Killed by a sibling, just as he had killed another brother many years before. Well, all in all, his reign shows how serial killing in medieval Spain sometimes wore a crown. Our first story was from the lower levels of society, and this is all the way to the higher-ups. Well, chroniclers certainly depict him as a cautionary tale of tyranny unchained, a ruler whose systematic murders nearly unmade his entire kingdom. And he might not fit the typical profile of a secretive murderer stalking unknown victims. Instead, he was brazen and public, abusing his royal protection to satisfy personal vendettas. I suppose it was only a matter of time until people got tired of that. Yet in terms of body count and repeated brutality, he's certainly in that group of history's worst homicidal figures. Indeed, a contemporary chronicler remarked that Pedro's soul must have been overtaken by una furia diabolica, a demonic fury. Committing such fratricides and betrayals, he had to have been possessed. And we see again the medieval inclination to attribute serial violence to a kind of madness or possession, an evil spirit of the highest cruelty. But let's look beyond the poisoners in genteel cities and beyond the kings in their palaces. Medieval Spain's most prevalent multiple murderers were likely the bandits and roving outlaws that infested the highways. The latter Middle Ages, that is the 13th to 15th centuries, was certainly a turbulent time of war and social upheaval, conditions ripe for brigands. After major conflicts, like the Reconquista battles or the civil wars, bands of deserters or mercenaries often took to a life of crime. In Castile, especially on the frontiers between the Christian and Moorish territories, these ruffians were known as Golfines, or salteadores. They robbed travelers, and they didn't hesitate to kill them as part of their depredations. We even have a pretty striking description from a 14th century document that captures the menace of such bandits. It laments that in certain regions, lawless men have killed the men and took what they carried, and assaulted the women, and ravaged and burned villages and committed many other evils. And this was not some isolated incident, but rather a larger pattern of behavior by these outlaw gangs. Such words appear in the context of petitions to the king as communities begged for protection. Of course, all of this murder and mayhem had to have some kind of solution, and for the moment, it forced the creation of the hermandades, or peacekeeping leagues of towns. For example, after the famous Battle of La Nava de Tolosa in 1212, a victory over the Muslims, many soldiers turned bandits prowled the roads. In response, the towns of Toledo, Talavera, and Ciudad Real formed one of the earliest kind of police forces to jointly police the highways. These brotherhoods, and later the Santa Hermandad under the Catholic monarchs, could be seen as an early form of organized crime fighting. aimed largely at serial offenders like bandit gangs. But some bandit leaders attained infamy, kind of akin to later Wild West outlaws, I suppose. In the kingdom of Aragon and Catalonia, there were feuding bandit factions in the 15th to 16th centuries, the Ñeros and the Cadels, though those belong more to the Renaissance era, but probably should mention them anyway. They got their roots in medieval times. In medieval Castile, chronicles mention figures such as Gutiérrez Dries de Viera, a knight from Uqueda who went rogue with a band of armed men in the early 15th century. While details on Gutiérrez are pretty scant, one record notes that even some nobles turned outlaw, blurring the line between gentry and brigandage. Now, these outlaws would use their military training to overpower victims and might even enjoy protection from local power brokers, and that makes them pretty hard to catch and pretty hard to prosecute. The Hermandades complained that occasionally a powerful lord or knight would shield the malefactors, highlighting the complicity that sometimes let serial criminals thrive. Maybe they were getting a cut of the spoils from the bandits, who knows? But one area particularly notorious for bandit murders was the rugged Sierra Morena, the mountain range in southern Castile. This natural borderland between Castile and Andalusia harbored countless hideouts. Records from the late 1400s in Andalusia indicate high rates of homicide. Well, there are numerous instances of bandits waylaying and killing travelers in that region, and that's just the ones we have written down. The Count of Tendilla even wrote to the crown urging more action, saying that after the Reconquista advances, quote, there remained in the Sierra Morena some evildoers they called Golfines, and that these had to be rooted out with armed force. The crown granted certain knights and towns the right to erect fortified houses and keep militias, specifically to combat the murderous bands. In effect, medieval Spain waged a long guerrilla war against serial-killing bandits, a war only decisively won by the late 15th century, as the state centralized its power. The creation of the Santa Hermandad, the Holy Brotherhood, under Queen Isabella around 1476, was a nationwide effort to stamp out remaining banditry. And I think it's pretty telling that one of its proudest achievements, at least according to its records, was ending the careers of many of those salteadores who had murdered and plundered across Castile. But for the common folk, these outlaws were the real serial killers that they feared in daily life. A poisoner in the family, or a murderous lord was pretty rare. But a journey from one town to the next always carried the risk of encountering some sort of bandit. Spanish folklore and ballads of the Middle Ages and early Renaissance are full of these tales. Bandolero, they call them. Some romanticize them, others curse them. The difference between legend and reality could also become a bit blurry, just as English folklore later produced highwaymen heroes like Robin Hood. Spain had its own share of outlaw legends. Yet, behind many legends were very real cutthroats. One can imagine villagers recounting how El Camino, the road that is, was unsafe because a certain gang had killed 3 travelers this month, a primitive kind of killer profile passed on by oral tradition. And so unlike those stealthy poisoners or palace plotters, bandit/killers were usually hunted down and summarily executed when caught. Medieval courts often didn't bother with lengthy trials for them. It was a pretty open and shut case, A captured highwayman caught in the act of murder could be strung up from the nearest tree as an immediate justice. In 1460, for instance, 2 men of the Hermandad of Toledo were actually arrested, somewhat paradoxically, for killing a robber without due process, demonstrating that even vigilantes had to be careful not to overstep things, don't get too angry and fly off the handle. Nevertheless, the general sentiment in law was that killing a serial murderer, like a bandit caught red-handed, was really not a crime at all, but rather a kind of public service. Hence, the Hermandades were empowered to pursue and dispatch such criminals. By 1500, the chronicler Pulgar wrote with satisfaction that travelers could move about Castile without danger from bandits. Maybe a little bit optimistic, but it certainly reflects the crown's concerted purge of those multi-murderers. So in essence, the bandit as serial killer in medieval Spain was a figure shaped by social turmoil. He, and occasionally she, there are a few hints of female bandits, was often a former soldier or disenfranchised peasant who turned to robbing and killing as livelihood. The anonymity of the road allowed such killers to repeat their crimes many times. A string of slain wayfarers in a remote past might not even be recognized as connected incidents in that era, but only when patterns of violence became obvious to communities. Let's say, for example, everyone saying don't travel through that forest. Everyone knows that there's bandits there. You're asking for trouble. Well, that sort of thing managed to get a concerted response. Thus, the outlaws teach us that serial killing in medieval Spain was sometimes a group affair, a gang of murderers, and ultimately tied to the fabric of feudal society, where private violence thrived in the gaps left by weak central authority. So we've certainly seen a few pretty emblematic cases, right? The poisoner, the king, and of course all of those assorted bandits who kind of just fell through the historical record. A pretty varied face of serial murder. But you have to note, too, that events like that, while they did happen, were certainly not commonplace in medieval life. They were extraordinary enough to be recorded with shock or used as examples of moral decline. Now, this rarity contributed to a climate of fear and fascination. People in the Middle Ages were just as horrified by multiple murders as we are today, if not even more, because they often lacked the rational framework to understand them. And as a result, myth and reality intertwined together in the medieval imagination. For instance, we've mentioned a little bit about werewolf lore in the other videos, and accusations of witchcraft sometimes offered an explanation for medieval killings. And in the lands that would later become Spain, witch trials were relatively few in the medieval period. Spain's major witch hysteria came in the early 17th century. However, the notion of a human predator disguised as a beast was certainly not absent. In 1253, a law from King Alfonso X's code even mentions werewolves in passing, reflecting that the concept was certainly known, and that's 800 years ago, so certainly pretty deep roots. Now, while medieval Spain doesn't have a famous werewolf serial killer case from that time, the cultural groundwork was well and truly laid for interpreting bizarre murders as the work of shape-shifting monsters or devil worshippers. If a string of child murders occurred in a region, one could imagine villagers blaming El Hombre Lobo, the wolf man, or perhaps even a witch's coven, rather than just the ordinary neighbor. And this mindset was something that persisted for centuries. Notably, Spain's first recorded serial killer of the modern era, Manuel Blanco Romasanta in the 1850s, actually claimed to be a cursed werewolf when he was giving his defense. The fact that even in the 19th century a Spanish murderer thought that claim was plausible in court shows how deeply rooted those old legends were. And just quickly, we won't go on too much about it since it is 19th century, but Romasanta, and actually dubbed the Werewolf of Alares, admitted to killing 13 people, and was indeed convicted, a grim bridge between medieval myth and modern forensic reality. Perhaps we'll discuss him in the more modern killers video. But another medieval Spanish fear was of that secret poisoner, an anxiety that spiked in the late Middle Ages with cases like Sancho's and others. The very word embayador, literally poisoner, became synonymous with hidden treachery. People grew suspicious of unusual illness or sudden deaths, imagining a serial poisoner at work. And some of these suspicions were unfounded or perhaps exaggerated. But that didn't mean they did not prompt real precaution. The Crown of Aragon, for example, issued ordinances controlling the sale of toxic substances after a few high-profile poisoning incidents. Chronicles also recount rumors, for example, that King Pedro's hated stepmother, Queen Juana de Enriquez, had serially poisoned upper claimants to ensure her own son's succession. A tale swirling around the death of Prince Charles of Viana in 1461. And while it is unclear if Juana ever did so, and certainly hard to prove now with all the time gone, the fact that people spread such rumors suggests that the concept of a serial poisoner was well and truly in the public conscience. Moreover, medieval Spanish literature reflects a kind of fascination with murder. Take the exemplos of Don Juan Manuel, early 14th century, or later ballads. They often include murderous deeds as moral lessons, or a thrilling plot note. One of Don Juan Manuel's tales involves a man who habitually murders his guests until he is outwitted at an inn, a story that foreshadows the murderous innkeeper trope. But whether based on any real Spanish event, that is a little bit more difficult to know. But it does echo a pan-European folklore, like the legend of the murderous barbers, or the bakers in Paris who turned their victims into pies, the medieval tale that later inspired Sweeney Todd. But I'm sure you'd know that because you watched my medieval French killers video. Absolute banger. Well, Spaniards likely heard versions of such grisly legends and perhaps even localized them. These cautionary tales served as both entertainment and warning, though. But, once again, tiptoeing that blurry line between legend and reality. But importantly, medieval Spaniards believed that the justice of God would ultimately expose serial killers, even if human authorities struggled to. Hagiographies, or saints' lives, and miracle stories sometimes feature a serial murderer brought down by divine intervention. For example, a Catalan folk legend tells of a cruel noble who murdered a string of pilgrims, until one of the victims turned out to be an angel in disguise, leading to the noble's doom. It's an awkward mistake, isn't it? But a clear moral that serial killing is such an affront to heaven that heaven itself, after a while, has to intercede. The Church also preached that unrepentant murderers would suffer eternal damnation. This spiritual framework meant that, while terrified of killers, communities also felt some reassurance that cosmic justice loomed. It didn't always comfort the victims in the moment, sure, but certainly helped medieval society cope with the incomprehensible, that each serial murderer while a criminal was marked for hellfire in death. And we all have to die eventually. But of course, if you go to the records in Spain and start flicking through the books looking for asesino en serie, the term for serial murderer, you're not going to find it. But that doesn't mean the absence of a term meant the phenomenon was absent. Medieval chroniclers and court records do describe individuals who killed repeatedly, even if their motives were interpreted in very different ways. The medieval Spanish world view tended to explain serial violence through religion and morality, not unique to them, but with a few different twists. When confronted with an inexplicable multiple murder case, people often invoked the diabolical. For example, in late medieval Europe, many communities believed that only a demonic force could drive a person to butchery again and again. In the witch and werewolf trials of the 15th to 17th centuries, some accused were in fact serial killers by modern standards, murdering and sometimes even cannibalizing their victims. But their contemporaries labeled them wolves in human form, or agents of the devil. Let's look at the werewolf trial of 1590 in Germany against Peter Stump, for example, executed for 16 gruesome murders, a famous case outside Spain. In such trials, fragmented and exaggerated records make it pretty hard to separate truth from folklore. Historians suspected a few of the accused really were serial killers by a modern definition, while others were hapless beggars, tortured into false confessions. But there is a key point, and that is that medieval society readily attributed multiple murders to monstrous evil, not to any normal human compulsion. In Spain, which was a strongly religious culture, the mindset was evident in the late medieval witchcraft and blood libel legends, notably the ritual murder myths, the belief that Jews were conspiring to kill children repeatedly took hold in Spain later and less fervently in northern Europe. When such accusations did arise, such as in the infamous Santa Niño de la Guardia case of 1491, they reflect a medieval tendency to see serial killing as a ritualized plot and not the work of some lone psychopath. In this case, several Jews, conversos that is, were accused of collectively murdering a child in a bizarre ritual. Modern research does indicate that the crime didn't actually happen, though, yet the Inquisition executed the suspects anyway. The serial murderer in this scenario was an imagined conspiracy of evildoers, showing how Spanish Christians' fears of repeated murder often focused on marginalized groups and supernatural culprits. Now, despite the mythic overlays, medieval Spain did recognize very real serial offenders in its midst. They just categorized them by their crimes, whether that be thieves, murderers, or poisoners, rather than really looking into this pattern of pathology. Chroniclers wrote of bloodthirsty nobles and knightly wrongdoers who committed violence and things of the like habitually. Court documents and law codes record cases of outlaws who killed multiple travelers, or poisoners who eliminated one victim after another for gain. What modern criminologists might label a lust murderer or a hedonistic serial killer would in a medieval source likely be called a traitor or a devil-possessed heretic, or more simply, the notorious malefactor. Crucially, motive was viewed through a moral lens. Medieval Iberia had no concept of homicidal sexual predators in a modern sense. If someone murdered repeatedly for sadistic pleasure, well, people just struggled to comprehend it as anything but manifest evil, or even insanity. More commonly, repeat murder was tied to greed, vengeance, or power struggles. Familiar motives that medieval authorities did recognize and punish. Well, it is worth noting, too, that serial killing is not a new or uniquely modern phenomenon at all. One of the earliest known serial killers in Europe was a French nobleman, Gilles de Rais, who we discussed in the France video. A former comrade of Joan of Arc, who in 1435 notoriously kidnapped and murdered perhaps as many as 300 children by some accounts. That's if you believe it. There's a bit of argument about that. In any case, the result was that he was tried and executed in 1440, and later generations remembered him as a real-life Bluebeard. Well, in any case, let's move on and have a look at a little bit of the law and justice systems. Throughout the Middle Ages, Spanish realms, both Christian kingdoms and Islamic Al-Andalus, had relatively localized law enforcement. There was no police in the modern sense. Instead, communities policed themselves through town guards, militias, and the aforementioned brotherhoods of towns, the hermandades, especially in late medieval Castile. Royal officials like alguacile and merinos might hunt notorious outlaws. But the problem is resources were quite limited. As a result, a clever murderer could strike multiple times before being caught, especially if they targeted travelers or strangers. On the other hand, towns were tight-knit. If someone kept killing their neighbors or kin, word and suspicion would spread quickly, often culminating in swift vigilante or judicial justice. Medieval Spanish law codes, such as the 13th century Siete Partidas of Castile, did not mince their words about murder. Homicide was a grave felony, a crime against not just king, but God. And if you got caught, well, you could expect a brutal punishment, not just as a retribution, but as a warning to others. A single murder could merit execution by hanging or decapitation. Serial or multiple murders invited truly ferocious penalties. The idea of serial killing was usually folded into concepts like massacre, treason, or notorious malice, which justified exemplary punishment. In Christian Spain, execution methods ranged from beheading for nobles to hanging or burning alive for commoners. It all depended on the circumstance. Not just how bad the crime was, but also how well connected the individual was. They wouldn't be burning nobles at the stake. Well, perhaps they did sometimes, but it was extremely rare. Or they would burn them after they'd been hanged, as was the case in our medieval France killers video. And in Islamic Al-Andalus, likewise, the Sharia law for hiraba, that is violent crimes like highway robbery involving murder, allowed for crucifixion or dismemberment as deterrents. We all know medieval justice was pretty harsh, operating on the principle that extreme crimes deserved exemplary punishment to instill fear. Kind of like saying, this is what happens if you take that path. A revealing example of legal response to a serial-type crime comes from Valencia in 1442, and that is the case of Sanxo Calbó introduced earlier. Once the authorities suspected Sancho of poisoning multiple family members, they spared no means to secure a confession and set an example. The trial record shows that the court, faced with initial denials and a couple of contradictory statements from the accused, resorted to torture, and this was legally allowed in especially egregious cases. Under torture, Sancho confessed everything: how he obtained the arsenic, in small doses from different apothecaries around town, how he sprinkled the toxin in well water, wine, and food over time. All the details, and everything matched up. It all finally made sense. This full confession detailed multiple deliberate murders, his daughter, mother-in-law, and attempted murders of others in the household. And in the eyes of 15th century justice, Sanxo Calbó's crimes were virtually unparalleled in cruelty and betrayal. He had murdered his own family for greed. He killed his own child for money. The demand for spectacular punishment was high. According to the Valencian local laws, the prescribed penalty for a man who poisoned family members was to be buried alive. In Sancho's sentence, the judges added a gruesome twist, befitting the horror of the crime. He was to be buried alive with the corpse of his daughter laid atop his body. This pretty chilling sentence, effectively forcing the murderer into a grave with his victim, and it was intended to satisfy the public outrage. Contemporary accounts note that the populace wanted a punishment in public view, and as cruel as the crime itself. So in practice it seems the authorities did carry out the live burial, but perhaps only symbolically. One chronicle indicates Sancho was pulled out before death and then hanged on the gallows to finish the execution. Either way, the message is pretty clear. Now, another facet of the medieval justice system was the involvement of experts and community members in solving and adjudicating these crimes. In Sancho's trial, for instance, we see an early form of forensic medicine at work. Physicians were called as expert witnesses to examine victims and identify poison. Neighbors gave testimony about hearing screams and seeing the afflicted crawling on the ground in despair during the poisoning, which of course helped establish the timeline of the crime. Even a parish priest played his own role, attempting cures for the mysterious illness that ultimately detected poison, for which he administered that antidote, that water that had touched the unicorn's horn. Oh, by the way, at the time what they called unicorn horn was, as we mentioned, the tusk of a narwhal whale or a rhinoceros horn. And yes, it was very expensive to get. It's a nice little detail, though. The village curate wielding a supposed unicorn horn to counteract arsenic shows how medieval people combined superstition with medical knowledge and a bit of religion. But ultimately it shows that repeat murders, especially by stealthy means like poison, prompted considerable investigation and folk diagnosis. The community wasn't really willing to passively accept multiple unexplained deaths. They wanted explanations, oscillating between the scientific and the magical. I suppose whichever one offered more comfort. So, which one did you like? Suppose we can't really choose favorite killers. Did you like the poisoner, or did you like Pedro the Cruel, that king? Quite obnoxious, I think. Terrible people. It would be nice to know a bit more about those bandits. Maybe I'll just make a video about bandits in medieval times, That could be a good idea, I think. In any case, that is enough for today. Now, as is tradition, I'm going to read out my top-tier patrons and supporters. So we've got Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stefan, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Taubery, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum? Rhonda, Gary, Katie B, Lovely, Poma, Kevin, Marissa, Altazakin, Lucy, Julianne, Rosie, Tivolo, Chris, Apocalyptic, Brandy, Wolfsbane, Dude, Brinny, Aidan, Fabian, Michael, Agworm, Prince of Persia, River, Indian Trail, Catherine, Alexa, Big Gun 101, Brandy, Pesty Hunt, Stevie, and Jessica. Thank you. Well, we had a good time with all of our undesirables again. And let us hope that in our own lives we do not meet any of these kinds of undesirables. Certainly not the kinds of ones we want to run into in dark alleys or on those country roads. Do watch your backs out there. You never know. In any case, that is enough for me. Good night, lots of love to you all, and stay safe. Farewell for now.